Okay. Good evening to everyone. I'm Dana Ripper with the Missouri River Bird Observatory, or MRBO, and also with us tonight is my co-founder and co-director Ethan Duke, who looks like a uh, frog tadpole right now, probably to y'all. We are at the Missouri River Bird Observatory, where our mission is the conservation of birds and all wildlife and their habitats through science, education, and advocacy. I can't believe it. We're here at the very last session of the 2026 Naturalist webinar series, and I suppose it's pretty appropriate because it's like 87 degrees or whatever here in central Missouri right now. So I guess we're done with the winter series. I do want to note that we have recorded all of the webinars. They will be up on the MRBO YouTube channel quite soon, the whole series, plus a whole bunch of other recordings from various webinars over the last few years as well. I want to take a moment just to thank all of you for joining us, especially folks that have stayed with us for all the sessions. I hope that everyone has taken away some good information to share with others in the spirit of conservation. I also would like to take this opportunity to express the appreciation of all of us at MRBO for our financial supporters, many of whom are on this Zoom tonight. Things have gotten real tight at MRBO. You've probably heard bits and pieces about the very deep funding cuts to federal and state conservation and environmental education programs, along with lessened means for a lot of individual donors these days. And these situations are really starting to trickle down to our organization. So for folks that are able to give to MRBO, thank you. We literally could not continue delivering all the programs that we do without your support. As always, I'm going to put some links in the chat for some upcoming events. These are all in-person events here in Missouri. They are pretty self-explanatory, and we've talked about them before, and you can just follow the links. So I'm not going to explain all of them in the interest of getting to our program this evening, but here are some upcoming events at which everyone is most welcome. And onto our webinar of the evening. Our last speaker in the series is one of the stars of the grassland conservation world. I've heard Dr. Boyle speak in person and virtually and have followed her from afar for many years. And I don't mean that to be creepy. I'm just a huge fan. And I'm very grateful, Alice, that you're here to speak with us tonight. Dr. Alice Boyle is a professor at Western University in London, Ontario since last year, 2025, having spent 13 years at Kansas State University previously. She studies both grassland and tropical birds, answering questions about migration and dispersal movements and the consequences of rain for birds and other endotherms. You can learn more at her very cool website, which I shall also now put in the chat. And Dr. Boyle, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Dana. Can everybody hear me okay? I can't see or hear you, but if I get a thumbs up,
You sound good.
Okay, great. Awesome. Well, I am thrilled to be talking to you all, and I'm really excited by how many people registered for this event. Makes me incredibly happy that you care enough to come to listen to a talk about grassland birds and the things that matter so deeply to me. So, as Dana said, I had the great privilege to live in this landscape for 13 years. I had no idea how much I like grasslands before I moved to Kansas in 2012. I actually grew up in the northern part of the Central Great Plains up in Winnipeg, but I never saw grasslands. I just saw agricultural fields, and I quickly fell in love with them. And I now find that grasslands are like really, really special places. And I hope I can convince you tonight about why, some of the reasons why that is true. So although I'm speaking to you from Southern Ontario, my heart in some ways is still in Kansas. And, I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to go to Kansas. I know there's people from many places in this call, but this picture that you're looking at right now is a picture of the Flint Hills, which is one of the last places in the world where you can see in native unplowed, old growth, long, tall grass prairie anywhere in the world, big expanses of it anyway. So the central grasslands are this big, huge area in the middle of North America, extending from Alberta down to northern Mexico. And it was once this place, kind of like the Serengeti, that was dominated by just massive, massive numbers of huge ungulates that roamed the landscape and kept it in grassland and created a very special landscape. And of course, it's really changed right now, but there are glimpses of what that landscape once looked like. And the tall grass prairie is just one tiny piece of the central grasslands, and it extended further east. What you're looking at on the right here is a map of sort of recent historic extent of tall grass prairies in that pale green color. And you can see in the dark green color everywhere where there were still tall grass prairies about probably about 2 decades ago now. And the big chunk of it there, that little sort of in the eastern third of Kansas, is the Flint Hills, like that picture you were seeing before. And so, of course, there are a lot of different kinds of grasslands in North America. There's, in addition to tall grass prairie, there's mixed grass prairie, short grass prairie, Chihuahuan desert, Californian prairies. And everywhere you go, there are distinct vegetation characteristics. And of course, there's also distinct birds. And I want to just start by taking you a little bit of a tour of those grasslands, because I think all of us, we get to know one place. Maybe if you're lucky, you've gotten to know one grassland near you, maybe. And it's easy to sort of fall into that trap of thinking that they all look the same and they all sort of operate in the same way, but actually they're quite distinctive. And so we're going to start right up in the northern extent of this central area in the Canadian prairies. And the grasslands up there, these grasslands all have different temperature regimes, rainfall regimes, soils. And this is sort of a picture of what it might look like, or what it does look like actually in Saskatchewan at that northern edge. And some of the characteristic birds that you might find if you were to go here during the breeding season are Baird sparrows, Sprague's pipits, doing these lovely skylark calls up in the air during the breeding season, Swainson's hawks, and chestnut-colored longspurs. And probably many of you have seen these species during migration further south. We can go all the way sort of to the other end of the central grasslands, though, the desert grasslands, high plains in northern Mexico, parts of the southern states as well. And at the southern ends of those grasslands, you can see things look a little different. You get those mountains in the background, you get some deserty kind of type plants in around the edges, and we get their own specific special species, things like the palmetto falcon, which is now greatly severely threatened, of course, near extirpated in North America, although there are some in South America too. And cool little birds like this Worthen sparrow, whose range is so tiny, it just is shown in this range map by a few little dots, endemic to these tiny little basins in northern Mexico. Then if we think about those east-west gradients, way on the western edge up against in Colorado near the Rockies, we get arid shortgrass prairies, these high plains, and special birds like mountain plovers, burrowing owls, and lark buntings. And then moving over to the eastern edge of those Great Plains, we get tallgrass prairies, which are the ones that I know best from my work in Kansas. So eastern Great Plains, these tallgrass prairies are wet enough that they're sort of constantly at war with the woodlands, and that ecotone is constantly shifting back and forth. But it has its own distinct avifauna as well. Of course, eastern meadowlarks, dickcissels, Henslow's sparrows, and then my personal favorite, the grasshopper sparrow, because I've done an awful lot of work on these little guys over the past 13 years, and they've captured a piece of my heart. Aw, and somebody else's heart too. Thank you. So these are all species that you might find during the breeding season in these grassland areas. But you'll maybe notice that most of these, if depending on where you live, are probably not around during the non-breeding season, except in the Missouri area, maybe you get eastern meadowlarks in the winter, but these other ones aren't going to be around. And that's because grassland birds are highly migratory. And they don't all just sort of go to one place, but they all have intriguing migratory movements. The grasshopper sparrows that I studied in eastern Kansas, and that I'm still studying actually, go mainly down to northern Mexico. And many of the other birds that breed a little further north, like Sprague's pipits and Baird sparrows, also go to those same kinds of wintering areas. But right alongside the grasshopper sparrows, the neighboring dickcissel, a stone's throw away, that bird migrates all the way to northern South America, using these a lot of flooded grasslands and increasingly rice fields in the northern, sort of a northern equivalent or southern equivalent rather of the kind of flooded grasslands that you might find in central Florida. And then other birds also nesting right alongside the dickcissels and the grasshopper sparrows. One of my personal favorites, upland sandpipers, do these absolutely phenomenal migratory pathway, going from the grasslands of central North America to the grasslands of the southern hemisphere. And they cross the Andes twice, and they do absolutely phenomenal migratory flights, and they do this back and forth every year over their lives, and that fact alone just kind of blows me away. So there's your first hint of some of the things that I think are cool about grassland birds. One of the things that I think is kind of a big misconception is that people talk a lot about how diverse grasslands are. And from my perspective, as coming to study grasslands from being a tropical biologist, they actually aren't that diverse, especially the bird community. And although I don't think they're not a lot of species, I think they are incredibly special. They have this diversity of habitats, and even more so microhabitats, shapes a whole bunch of different needs and behaviors. They're entirely dependent on these grasslands, and they do things that birds nowhere else in the world do. So what I'm going to do for the next little bit is talk to you about how and why I think what they do is interesting and different and special, and hopefully convince you that they're, although grassland bird communities don't have a ton of species in them, they really are absolutely dependent on what all of us do in the next 50 years for their persistence. So birds in the tall grass prairies, those flint hills of eastern Kansas. This is sort of the core group of species that I, am up worrying about at night. Henslow's sparrow is on the right, greater prairie chickens, eastern meadowlarks, grasshopper sparrows, upland sandpipers, and common nighthawks. And I've arrayed them from left to right, right to left on this screen because they kind of symbolize for me this gradient of what grassland birds need and how particular each one of them is. Each one needs some very specific combination of very fine scale vegetation characteristics. And we look at this grassland, especially if you're driving down the interstate, which, is a lousy way to observe the prairie. And it looks pretty uniform out there. But if you start walking around in that grassland, you start to see, if you're tuned to it, an amazing variety at the very sort of local scale of what that vegetation looks like. And of course, it changes throughout the year as well. And that heterogeneity, that patchiness is what makes this bird community tick. So over on the right side of the graph here, or the not graph, sorry, the image, the Henslow sparrows and the greater prairie chickens, they really thrive on the tall, dense, thick stuff that you get, especially when there isn't that much grazing. They absolutely require that kind of vegetation structure in which to have successful nests. They both hide their nests really well inside these deep clumps. And if there isn't that tall, dense vegetation, either they won't attempt to nest at all, or it will become depredated very quickly. It will lose the nest, and that is actually sort of number one cause of greater prairie chickens decline in the Flint Hills, just lack of that tall, dense vegetation. If we move over to the far opposite end of the picture here, we see common nighthawks. And probably some of you have found common nighthawk nests. They're kind of funny because it's hard to even call them a nest. It's just like, oh, here's a nice gravelly bare patch of ground. I think I'll lay my eggs here. And their eggs kind of look like a piece of rock as well, but they need that bare patchiness for their nests. We can completely opposite end of what kind of little micro habitat they need. And then in between, we have kind of everything in between. So meadowlarks are somewhere in between grasshopper sparrows and prairie chickens and Henslow sparrows. But both grasshopper sparrows and upland sandpipers still like to hide their nests in these clumps of dead vegetation left over from last year. But then both of them prefer to forage out in more bare areas, areas that have been cropped by grazing animals. They'll pick bugs off the ground, and so they don't actually do well when it's very thick and dense. And I'm going to come back to this sort of heterogeneity because this patchiness of vegetation, because I really think that's what makes this community tick in many ways, and what one of the reasons that they're in trouble. So unfortunately, they are very much in trouble. So about 6 years ago, this paper came out in Science that documented how North America's birds have changed over the past 50 years. And this is just one figure. I promise you, this is the only graph in the whole presentation. This figure here shows you how the percent change in the number of like the abundances of birds, and also the proportion of species declining. A whole bunch of different guilds, from wetlands, coast, airlands, all the way down to grasslands. And you can see that there's only really one guild of bird here that appears to be increasing, and that's wetland birds. Thank you, Ducks Unlimited. But grassland birds are down here at the bottom. So they've undergone the most severe change in terms of reduction in the number of individuals, and also the greatest proportion, 3/4 of the species are declining, statistically in trouble. And so this paper made a big splash. It got a lot of people's attention and, of course, public attention, but it also really mobilized a lot of ornithologists to do something more, to do better, and to really sort of put efforts together in a way that would sort of help reverse those declines, and ensure that we don't completely lose whole guilds of birds that are native to our part of the world. So something that grew out of that paper was an effort called the Road to Recovery. As part of that effort, scientists categorize species based on the urgency of doing something about their declines. And so I'm going to go through some of those categories, and we're going to look at the grassland species that fall into those categories. So at the top of the list, Tier 1, very high urgency. These are species for which there's been very large long-term population loss, over 75% loss over those 50 years. And the rate of loss is continuing or accelerating in recent decades. Out of all the birds in North America, there were 22 species that fell into that highest category. And 3 out of those 22 were grassland birds. Out of, over 800 native birds, 3 of those species, mountain plovers, Sprague's pipits, and chestnut-collared longspurs. Tier 2, almost as bad, large long-term population loss, over 50%. And then again, this continued or accelerated declines. And 1 out of the 17 species in that category lives in grasslands, is a grassland obligate, and that's Henslow's sparrows, a species that you have in Missouri. I won't go off on a tangent on Henslow's. They're adorable too. Okay. Tier 3, this is moderate urgency. So these are species that have had large long-term declines, over 50% over those 50 years. But in the recent part of that time frame, that decline has slowed. Okay. So maybe a bit better news. There are 3 species out of the 21 in that category: thick-billed longspurs, bobolinks, and Baird sparrows. And then there are others, of course, that are not in those upper tiers, but are still obviously declining. An interesting case I just want to point out is that there were some species they couldn't assign a tier. And it's partly due to the source of the data that were used for these analyses. Some of you maybe have done breeding bird surveys, and a lot of the data for this paper came from breeding bird surveys. And the time of year when prairie chickens, both greater and lesser prairie chickens, are most detectable is when they're doing their displays right now, this time of year. And of course, breeding bird surveys happen later than that. And so we don't have great data over that same time period for some of these other species, but we know that they're going downhill pretty quickly as well. Okay, so that's, got a lot to worry about, definitely, in the grassland bird department. Why should we care? Why is it important that we have grassland birds, and why are they special? I'm going to give you 3 reasons why, personally, I think they're just super cool, and things that I think make them distinctive from some of the the forest-dependent woodland species that are more prevalent in the eastern United States and Canada. And I don't know if these are just 3 things that I came up with, but some of them have come out of my own work, my own observations, and this isn't like in a textbook or anything. This is my top 3 reasons. So one of them is that whenever I talk about birds and what I do and, why are they doing this thing, people often say, oh, is it because of food? And that is a reasonable question for birds, because a lot of birds are what's called food limited. That like the lack of food, the competition for food, determines where they are and what they do to a great degree. And this is true for warblers. And, one of the founders of modern ecology did this classic paper where he studied how warblers foraged in trees and showed that different species foraged in different parts of the tree in different ways. And so even though they're all the same size and they ate basically the same thing and they foraged in the same time in the same place, they were all subdividing the space available in a way that reduced the competition between species. And this has been a pretty foundational idea that's permeated a lot of how we study birds. But I don't think grassland birds are food limited, and it's not just me. So these ideas actually date back to the famous ecologist Weems, who did his PhD work in the Great Plains in the 70s, and he also didn't think they were food limited. So I'm in good company. So what do you need to be food limited, and what does that actually mean? So first of all, for competition for food to occur. We've got these couple of species here that live in the tall grass prairies. The species have to share resources, and that is absolutely true of these guys. They're all nesting at the same time in the same habitat. Their territories overlap each other. So they're all nesting on the ground. They're eating the same kind of stuff. They're feeding it to their offspring. They're all picking up little bugs off the ground and giving it to their babies. And they all kind of like the easy to digest bugs, things like caterpillars and spiders. Okay, so they definitely share resources. You also need those resources to be limited, so there can't be enough to go around, okay? And then you also need then the sharing of those resources to mean that, if I get enough to eat, then you don't get enough to eat. There needs to be a negative outcome for those species. And so when we study this stuff, we find that yes, there is definitely sharing of resources, but there doesn't seem to be much evidence for there to be not enough to go around. In these temperate grasslands, especially now, maybe with this reduced abundance of them, there seems to be a ton of food to go around. There's high productivity. These grasslands are just growing like crazy all through the spring and summer months. There's a lot of insects, and there's a lot of space per bird, So we don't have a lot of evidence for resource limitation, and we also don't see negative effects that we can find of sharing that food. And that's really kind of special because in most places that's not true. Most places you do see evidence of food limitation. Interesting, just a little aside, I actually think that these populations might be limited by predation risk. They get kind of hammered when they nest there. So poor little guys get eaten a lot. But that's an aside. Okay, so that's number one. I think it's cool. Structured in a different way. Another thing that maybe is relevant to you might find interesting is that they've co-evolved with brown-headed cowbirds. So cowbirds, as many of you know, lay their eggs in the nests of other species, and then those mothers and fathers raise the babies of the cowbird, and it's called brood parasitism. And we tend to project human morality onto the birds, and a lot of people really think this is terrible, and the poor host species, how could they? And it is true that in some places where cowbirds didn't historically live and where populations of the species that did live there are already in trouble, cowbird parasitism can be a problem. However, cowbirds have been part of grassland bird communities for a very, very long time. And, they didn't evolve with bison, simultaneously, but they certainly did take advantage of the big roaming herds of bison. They follow after them and eat the bugs that they scare up. And grassland birds have been living with cowbirds for a very long time, for a lot of their recent evolutionary history. And so work in my lab, especially work of one of my former students, S.K. Winicki, and other sort of long-term projects that we've had, we can't find any negative effects of parasitism. Well, I won't say any. We can find only very, very, very small effects, negative effects of parasitism on these grassland birds like dick thistles and grasshopper sparrows and meadowlarks. Cowbirds don't reduce their nest success, even though sometimes the cowbirds, in this case, this dick thistle has 2 eggs and the cowbird has 5. But however, that dick thistle is just as likely to be able to fledge her 2 baby dickcissel chicks as she would if she didn't have those cowbirds in there. The host females still lay the same number and size of eggs after parasitism. The nestlings seem to grow just fine. There's no reduction in nestling growth with cowbirds, and sometimes it actually gets faster with the cowbirds. Here's your cowbird chicken here, begging very loudly. You can see the white gape there. And there's a host chick there. And sometimes the host babies actually grow faster, potentially because the cowbird chick is so loud and causing the parent to provision the nest more than they would otherwise. So, at least in the grasslands, we don't need to feel bad about brown-headed cowbirds. We just get to marvel in how cool they are. It's a distant kind of amazing evolutionary outcome. Okay, so now number 3, my favorite reason. So, grassland birds are amazingly mobile. Okay, so I showed you the migration movements, which are, these round trip movements between a breeding area and a non-breeding area. But in addition to all that, it's becoming increasingly apparent that they do all sorts of other movements at other times of the year as well. And we can't even classify all of it so far, but I call a lot of it dispersal. And dispersal is a one-way movement, doesn't involve a return trip. So pretty much all birds do natal dispersal. They're born in one place and then they make a movement to a new place where they'll become parents. But then after that, they tend to stay in the same place. So like a robin in your backyard is probably, if you see another robin in the same tree the next year having a nest, it could well be the same one, okay? But with grasshopper sparrows and henslow sparrows and a bunch of other grassland-dependent birds, that simply isn't true. It's almost certainly a different one, okay? And not only did they disperse between years, but they disperse even within the same breeding season. This is something that I've spent an awful lot of time working on. And so I've worked on it with grasshopper sparrows and with henslow sparrows as well. But I just want to highlight what happened to me. When I first moved to Kansas and I decided I was going to study movements of grassland birds, and I went to the Kanza Prairie where I decided to work and set up these plots in different watersheds, and we captured the birds and we put these little color bands on their legs, and so it's like a name tag, like this guy has yellow over yellow on the left side, and I don't know what his right side is, but it might be blue, dark blue over orange, blue over silver. They all have their own little names. So we banded all the birds that we could, and we started going back and resurveying, and an amazing thing happened because we go back after a few weeks, and what we found was that these birds were just moving all around, and some of the birds that we banded moved somewhere else, and we found them there, and birds that were banded disappeared, and unbedded ones came and took their place. And so very quickly, my first season is like, I think I want to start with this within season movement stuff. And so Emily Williams, who was a master's student when I first started at Kansas, was studying this, and her thesis work focused on this, and found all sorts of cool stuff. But one of the neat things was that those dispersers, the ones that moved, were actually had better luck nesting again after they moved than the ones that stayed put. So it seems like there's something to this movement, that they're actually, getting something out of it. Now, of course, the next thing we want to know is like, well, how far are they going? When they leave our study site, where do they go? Do they just go over the fence line? Because that will help us figure out like why they move at all. And or do they go somewhere really far? Because it might be have to do with like the management, right? Might be whether the area was burned or unburned, or whether it's grazed or ungrazed, or how much it's grazed, or all that sort of thing. And so we started sampling birds' feathers to determine whether it was this short-term movement or whether they were moving over long distances through the Great Plains. And there's this really cool thing about feathers is that when a bird eats, when it's growing feathers, it incorporates sort of the chemical signature of where it is into its feathers. So these new growing feathers on this little bird are going to reflect something about the place where it grew those feathers. Um, but then once they've finished growing, all the blood supply is cut off. And that means that the feather just locks in that location. So you can find something about where a bird was when it grew its feathers by plucking some of those older feathers and relating that to the sort of chemical landscape. And um, I'm happy to answer questions about that. I won't go any further into that. And what we found that basically from this study was that the feather, if they were just moving short distances, then the chemicals in those new feathers would match our local, the local signature. But in fact, birds were traveling mostly, we think, over, 100 kilometers or so, a state away, between years, which is kind of remarkable. And something that we kind of didn't expect or didn't, not common, not the kind of thing that people expect birds to be doing. Okay, luckily, we're finding more and more about this, and I just want to highlight some recent work because over the past 4 years, maybe, I've been collaborating with other folks in Kansas. We created this network of automated telemetry receiver stations, and I know you guys have a great network of MODIS stations in Missouri as well. And from these stations, every little dot here, the gray ones and the green ones are all active stations. We're starting to get individual tracks of these birds moving around Kansas and Missouri and Nebraska and Oklahoma, moving around within the season. So this last season was the first time we finally got these dispersal movements, and it was just so exciting. One of the most cool things is that we put them on males that we thought had nests that were going to stay because we put the tags on birds for a different study. And many of them took off in the middle of the night. And this is something that I don't think is known for any birds. Like, when does dispersal happen? Well, it happens at night, just like the migration. And they toured around the Flint Hills. This is one guy who sort of, he had a nest and then he's like, okay, I'm out of here, up and traveled around over the course of about 3 nights. Some of them ended up coming back to the area where they were. Others went all the way, 250 kilometers north, went up to Kearney, Nebraska, and presumably, had another nest up there because this was only early June. So we're finally getting like the direction and the distances and the stuff from these movements. And I'm going to be doing a bit more of that over the coming years as well. So why do they do all these movements? Why is this third piece? Like, what drives them to make those movements? And I think there's a couple of reasons. One, and it's really an adaptation, I think, to the huge variability of the Great Plains, the variability and unpredictability of what is going to be out there. And any of you who live in the middle of the continent know that the weather is certainly unpredictable, right? You get these big swings of weather from week to week, day to day, even. We get between year differences. And you never really know what it's going to be like. So there's weather unpredictability. There's also like this very intense spatial patchiness of management. There's fires, there's grazing, there's different intensities of grazing. And that unpredictability of what it's going to be like in one place at any one time, paired with the fact that over the season, those grasslands are growing the whole time, means that, and you think about those specific little habitat requirements that I told you about that for each species, they're trying to find those exact characteristics wherever they are, and they're going to go and find those things. That's what I think is going on. All right, so now we're going to get into a little bit more depressing part here. So why are they declining so much? Number one, It's simple. It's habitat loss, and number one cause of habitat loss is simply plowing it up. This is a national park in Nebraska that honors the Homestead Act, and the Homestead Act was really uh, pretty terrible for the prairies of North America. Along with the plowing came the fence, and that altered how big animals operated on the landscape. There was also the railway, which brought people, brought hunters, further disrupted the big migrations of bison that used to shape this landscape. And of course, direct persecution of bison, really as a form of genocide of in Native American peoples, was really quite horrific. And they were nearly exterminated. We almost lost bison entirely, but fortunately, a few were protected and have made somewhat of a comeback. However, the whole ecosystem functioning in the context of those big movements have not returned. And unfortunately, people do continue to plow up the prairie. So this is the plow print report is something that the World Wildlife Fund publishes each year, and they document, they measure every year how much prairie is dug up, plowed up. And although the rate is slowing, I'm glad to say, in the 2024 plow print, there were still 1.9 million acres of grassland plowed per year, primarily to make way for row crop agriculture. There are other growing ways that we're losing habitat in grasslands as well. One is urban expansion. I'm sorry to say that Kansas State University turned a former prairie chicken lek into a golf course. Even where we do keep grasslands, sometimes that habitat gets very degraded. So it can be overgrazed, it can be overburned. So just vast areas of very, very, very uniform vegetation, which, like I say, is not great for the whole community. It can be undergrazed and underburned, though, too. This is tough. If you don't have enough of that disturbance in these tall grass prairies, you constant war between the woodlands and the prairies. And so, unfortunately, more of that beautiful, big, grassy landscape looks more and more like this every year. And so, in the United States and Canada, the current status of agricultural conversion, about 4 football fields lost per minute. And in Mexico, croplands are expanding 6% per year. Contrast that with the current status of woody encroachment. The same amount is lost per year in the United States to woody encroachment as it is to agriculture. So in 1990, this is sort of the risk map. Red is already encroached, orange and yellow are at risk. And here's what that looks in 2022. So that expansion is happening remarkably quickly, and it's very concerning. I would say those are the big ones, but there are also concerns with energy development, especially in the northern Great Plains. So we can't let this get us down. We have to do something about it, right? And so you may be asking, what are the solutions? And I am here to bring you some good news because there are solutions. And one of the things that I think is most great about grassland birds is that a lot of those special behaviors allows them to work in sort of cohabit with humans in some working landscapes. And so that means that instead of like putting a fence around it saying keep out, there are ways to keep humans, human endeavors going while we also do our bit for the birds. So here are some of the solutions. First of all, we have to actually involve the private landowners who keep grass as grass. Most of the grass in the eastern part of the Central Great Plains and other parts of um, uh, eastern North America are only grass because there are people grazing them. And we need to involve landowners in doing the things that are good for grassland birds and making sure that it remains profitable for them to keep it grass. One of the ways that this is happening is that there are initiatives to sort of, um, you know, brand beef as bird friendly, just the same way as we've had bird friendly coffee for quite a long time. Support producers who are maintaining grasslands in healthy conditions, and reward them financially by paying a little bit more for their beef. That's one way you can do it. You can pay a bit more for your beef to buy from producers who are doing a good job. There are top-down financial incentives, perhaps not in the current political environment, but we can have hope that things will turn around. Incentives to keep grasslands grass side up, restoration efforts. Planting prairie is not nearly as easy and is keeping it from needing to be planted. But if it's already gone, there are ways to get it back. And even, not like the most pristine, most beautiful is still going to have a positive effect on grassland birds. Working at the landscapes, at the spatial scales that grassland birds operate on is really important. And if you think about that incredible mobility, we need to let that bird behavior guide the scale at which conservation and planning works. We can't just focus on our state or even one country. If you think about those upland sandpipers traversing the globe, this is sort of an annual animation of the relative density, understanding the threats to the whole annual cycle, working with scientists who are identifying full annual cycle threats and bottlenecks to conservation, and also some of the other sort of efforts of those working groups who are aiming to reverse the declines. Working across sectors is also really important. So one of the initiatives I've been part of is called the Central Grasslands Roadmap, and this involves a huge variety of partners. Involves private landowners, indigenous communities, state and provincial agencies, industry, non-governmental organizations, academia, funders, foundations, federal government, you name it. And the idea is to bring everybody together, get them on the same page, get people working in concert instead of in piecemeal. Number 6 is to communicate. And that's part of what I'm doing with you guys tonight. But if every one of you goes and convinces one or two other people that grasslands are beautiful, they're threatened, and they're valuable, they matter to you in more ways than you can imagine, then you'll be helping to do your part as well. We especially need to get this message out to people who don't have an opportunity to be in grasslands very much, to urban populations. We need to find ways to get those people out into grasslands and show them how amazing it can be. And you're just coming up on the next couple of months is just perfect timing to do this kind of thing. So see if you can work in a prairie walk with some friend who's never been out before. The last thing is to be hopeful. And this is sometimes a challenge, right? But I think some of those special things that I've told you about, the mobility, the flexibility of these birds, this helps them. This actually gives us some real reason to be hopeful that if we do something, it will have an effect. And we have seen examples of this before. So in Illinois, Henslow's sparrows were declining very, precipitously. And the Conservation Reserve Program that paid farmers to plant native grasses in unprofitable fields was initiated, and the birds started to show up. And so if we build it, they will come. That mobility is going to serve them well when it comes to responding to the positive actions that we do. So that is the end of my presentation. And I would be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you for listening.
We have some good questions in the chat or in the Q&A, excuse me. And lots of
Okay. Are you?
claps.
Oh,
I
thank
can
you.
I can read them to you if you like.
Well, should I
Or
just look at the chat? Is that what I should do?
sorry, Q&A, I misspoke. But yeah, you
Oh,
can
sorry.
definitely look at
Okay.
the Q&A. Yep.
Oh, I don't see the Q. Maybe you better read me the questions.
Let's see. And I have to say that they are things that I would like to know also.
Okay.
Okay, so Angela asks, does light pollution affect their movement with all the movements that they do?
That is a great question. And it likely does. I don't know of too many studies that is specifically focused on grassland birds and light pollution. We know that lights generally during migration are really bad, and grassland birds are no exception. So grassland birds hit skyscrapers and are attracted to light, and so paying attention to those lights out at night kind of warnings when migration is going to be at its peak in the next couple months and also again in fall. Then definitely.
As Katie asks, and this is harkening back to when you were speaking of the feather studies, how long does it take for them to grow a feather? I.e., what is the time frame that that one feather covers that you were talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, you know, I haven't measured it for grasshopper sparrows, but I'm pretty sure that it takes on the order of maybe 10 days or so. But they're growing, they're staggering. So they'll lose one and grow it and it start growing and lose another one. And so during molt, you'll see feathers of different ages. So the whole molt period will can easily take, a month.
Wind turbines. Do wind turbines affect our birds? Does it hit them or does it cause habitat fragmentation or both?
Oh, excellent question. Yeah. So, the more we know about turbines, the more it seems that direct mortality it's especially bad for bats. Not so much with birds, fortunately. Um, there is another major way, though, that turbines can influence grassland birds in particular, and that's that they're tall. And grassland birds evolved in a landscape where there wasn't very much tall out there, right? And they actually are fearful of tall things. They don't like trees. They don't like telephone poles. They don't like turbines, by and large, because I think just a innate fear of tall things, and ultimately driven by predation, the risk of getting eaten by something that was on top of it, probably.
Do invasive plants like honeysuckle negatively affect our grassland birds? I have heard those specific berries are bad for them.
Oh, well, grassland birds, except for dick thistles, maybe, don't really like shrubs so much. And so honeysuckle being shrub-like, I would say just by virtue of being a shrub, it's bad. Also, honeysuckle just, yeah. I don't know about the fruits being bad for them so much, though. I mean, they are very apparently tasty because a lot of things love to eat it. And I think if they're bad for them, probably birds are pretty good at figuring out what's bad for them. They're probably pretty good at not eating the things that will hurt them.
Marge asks, is there any chance CRP will be coming back?
I am not the right person to answer that. Sorry.
It hasn't really gone
It
away.
had
It's
exactly
not that it has gone away, but it has um
changed.
the payments aren't keeping up with what they need to be for incentives, right? And then also there's more actually demand than allowed acreage.
Enrollment. Yeah.
Yep. So Marge, we all hope so. And there's a lot of people working on it.
Yeah.
But it's not totally gone.
No.
Let's hope. Keep fingers crossed on that. um, how much, the great question. How much land is actually helpful for grassland birds? I volunteer on a 2.5 acre remnant prairie with some adjacent CRP. Am I going to see any of these there?
That is a great question. I would say it strongly depends on what surrounds that area. Um, if it's a forest, you're probably not going to see very much. But even if it's crop, definitely CRP good. But even crop doesn't seem to be, it's not viewed as an edge in the same way that urban or tree areas are. So yeah, I'd have to see the place. And also, I think kind of depends. Is it like long and skinny, got a lot of edge, or is it one big piece?
Alice, I sort of have a follow-up question to that question.
Hmm.
That acreage limitation, like
Hmm.
that might be different in breeding versus birds wintering. Do you think that's a correct statement?
I do. And I mean, in Central North America, it's almost a complete turnover in terms of grassland birds between winter and summer. Um, and also, it depends on the species. Like some seem to be um, more willing to, take up residence in the smaller patches, where in others really, like Henslow sparrows, if it's not some gigantic thing in Kansas anyway. I know in further east they'll take a small patch, but in Kansas, unless it's vast, they just don't go there. You're muted.
Are there, sorry, I was just saying interesting to myself. um, are there modus tagging projects going on right now in Kansas and or Missouri?
Yes. Um,
Yes.
shall I elaborate? I can vouch for Kansas because I'm going to be there in May and I'm going to be catching sparrows and putting tags on them. I have a colleague who's doing some modus work with bats in the summertime and then in the winter, Harris's sparrows.
Cool. Steve Olson says, a wonderful and inspiring presentation. Given your thoughts on dispersal, how much of an issue is fragmentation of grasslands? What kind of special area is needed to stabilize populations of grassland birds in general? And grasshopper because of diet or behavior.
Okay, I don't know about the last bit. I'll answer the first bit here. Um, um, I actually think the fragmentation issue isn't so bad for grassland birds as long as you do things like as long as the trees. I mean, like I said before, if it's grassland surrounded by something else that's low stature, it's maybe not such a big deal. The fact that they disperse so readily over whatever. They're good at getting places and they seem to be able to not have barriers to getting there in the way that some other species do. So I think that's a good thing. Now, I'm not sure about the grasshopper. Were you asking maybe about why grasshopper sparrows? Or if you're asking about why grasshopper sparrows are called grasshopper sparrows, it's not because they eat grasshoppers, which they do. It's not because they look like grasshopper, which they do, but it's because they sound like grasshopper sparrows. Their song is like, and it's a little fuzzy sound that's a grasshopper-like sound.
That was a perfect grasshopper sparrow sound. Veronica asks, will you continue to study grasshopper sparrows in Canada?
Hi, Veronica. I assume it's the same one. Yes, and Beard sparrows. So I couldn't resist coming back to Kansas to tag some grasshopper sparrows this year because I threw a lot of time and effort and money into the Kansas Motus, and I wanted to capitalize on that to get some more of these movements. But I'm also before I come down to Kansas, I'm going out to Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and I'm hoping to find, 7 or 8 field sites in the prairie provinces, and then also maybe 4 in Ontario, in a much patchier kind of context. And grasshopper sparrows across that gradient, and Baird sparrows as well in the western part as well.
We have a couple questions about prairie chicken and its status looks like legally. Is it true that the prairie chicken was recently stripped of protection status to benefit ranchers in Kansas?
Um, as far as I know, it was, but I also um, even when I lived in Kansas, it was really complicated and there was stuff going down that I didn't necessarily keep up with all the time. So again, I don't feel confident speaking to that.
Alice, I guess I would ask if we're talking about greater or lesser, right?
Oh,
Because
true.
so we've lost our greater prairie chickens
I
in
know.
Missouri. There might be a couple left, right? But so it's often very shocking to people, including myself sometimes, that they are still, a huntable species within limits in other states. But Marie might be talking about
Lessers,
the loss of endangered species status for lessers, maybe.
lessers, I think probably, yeah. Um, um,
So that wouldn't just be Kansas. I mean, that was a federal designation.
true. Yeah, yeah.
I'm conjecturing about someone else's
Yeah.
question right now.
I mean, I don't think graders have been listed, but lessers have, and then they were delisted. And I'm not privy to all the reasons why that happened. I don't think it's the right move, and I think people should stop hunting graders. And they're also in terrible shape. So I will say
Mhm.
my first greater prairie chicken I saw in Missouri many, many, many years ago.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. Me too. Me too.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, just to note that uh, there have always been conflicting interests, of course, in land management that Dr. Boyle talked a lot about, including some of the history. We just happen to have a Department of Interior that is extremely hostile towards science-based wildlife management right now. Back to nicer questions. Marie asks, I am from Edmonton, Alberta. Is
Oh.
there a grassland bird that I would have seen up there that comes down here to Missouri?
So hi. I'll be coming your way. Um, um, Maybe. Maybe. Yeah. So, Sprague's pipits are a real possibility. So they would breed up in Alberta. And I have seen Sprague's pipits on migration in Missouri. So yeah. In fact, we've documented quite a lot of Sprague's pickup movements in on the MODIS stations that we've installed, and some also you can track them using Missouri, passing through past stations in Missouri as well. And actually, one thing I want to mention is that anybody can get on modus.org and play around, and it's incredible wormholes that you'll go down probably, but you can see all these tracks of these different animals that have been tagged. Um, so. encourage you to do that. Maybe Swainson's hawks too, actually. You guys get Swainson's hawks, right? Maybe migration.
We do.
More
Not
common further
super
west.
regularly. I'm just checking the chat here just in case. I will send you this chat, Dr. Boyle, because there are a lot of nice comments in it. I do not see stray questions in there.
Okay.
So if nobody has any more questions, I think we all feel very happy with our last presentation of the season. So
All
thank you
right.
so much. Really, really glad that you could be here.
It's my
And
pleasure.
we will see everyone later in the month.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Thank
Thanks,
you for tuning
Alice.
in.
Thanks.